long shot. What are some of the things that we've studied that has happened in Joseph's family up to this point? Yes, we're going to get some deceit in this very chapter, but there is a ton of deceit. We see Jacob being deceitful multiple times, and it seems like his kids definitely picked up on that. Some of the other things, when we had Simeon and Levi after the Dinah incident, they just killed the entire town of Shechem, basically. Reuben has slept with one of his father's wives. So I bring this up to say Joseph's not coming from a perfect background, and I think that that's something that we can probably relate to as we have family drama. We probably don't have brothers that are going out and killing whole towns, but we probably don't come from perfect families either. Another point I want to make here is this idea of favorites. It is very clear that Jacob favors Joseph. This becomes clear to the brothers in this text once he's given the coat of many colors, or the robe of many colors, as the ESV translates it. But we've also seen kind of foreshadowing to this as well. If you remember back to when Jacob was getting ready to meet Esau, he put Rachel and Joseph in the back of the pack. They were the last ones to meet Esau, so if something went down, they're able to probably get away. So there's been some foreshadowing, but it's definitely on the brothers' minds that Joseph is the favorite at this time. And then one other point I wanted to make from these verses is this idea of the robe of many colors. So oftentimes when we think of the robe of many colors, we think of it in terms of the image I have on the slide. But the Hebrew word for that is I'm not going to pronounce this correctly, I'll just get that out of the way now, but the kitanet pasim, and it occurs one other time in Scripture in 2 Samuel 13:18. And if you were to read that, and we'll just go off the ESV since that's what we're looking at these passages in, but if you were to read that there, you would actually see that is going to be David's daughter Tamar, that's in regards to, and that's actually translated as a robe with long sleeves, which is a big difference from coat of many colors or robe of many colors. But the point of this, specifically in these verses, is that obviously Joseph's giving something his brothers are not. This is standing out to them that he has given this robe that they obviously don't have. And the other idea here that could be present is just like I wouldn't go to the gym in these clothes, because I'd get them all dirty, I'd look stupid. Like if you have a coat of many colors, if you have a robe with long sleeves, you're probably not going to be doing a lot of heavy lifting, right? You're not going to be out in the field with the sheep, things like that. It could be that this is also giving him a position that the brothers might envy a little bit, where he might be supervising them a little bit. And we would see that as we get down into verses 12 and beyond, when Joseph is actually sold into slavery. So a couple things to consider there. But any thoughts or comments on verses 1 through 4 of Genesis chapter 37? Yes?
You see that Jacob didn't really learn much from the favoritism of parents and the dangers of that from him and his brother.
Yeah.
I think that he would have kind of caught on to that by this point, especially with the last kid. But it's just permeating throughout the family, generation after generation.
Yep. You see a lot of that, especially with this family, and we've made the point here before, but that there's definitely a lot of introspection, at least on my part, to think like, am I passing on anything to my kids that I'm not going to want to see when I'm old and decrepit? Behaviors and things like that. So yeah, they're not learning the lessons that they should have learned. Anything else? Once again, I'm doing my best to scan for hands. If I'm missing somebody, please let me know. We'll go ahead and move on then. We'll go to the next verses. That'll be verses 5 through 11. But this is really where we start to see Joseph and his dreams. Beginning in verse 5, "Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, 'Hear this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright. And behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf.' His brothers said to him, 'Are you indeed to reign over us, or are you indeed to rule over us?' So they hated him even more for the dreams and for his words. Then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, 'Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars were bowing down to me.' But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, 'What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you?' And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind." So this is something that we're going to see a lot through the life of Joseph, that he has dreams, that he can interpret dreams, but this is really our introduction to it. What is the general meaning of the dreams that he has? What is the conclusion that the family draws from this? That's right. Ultimately, that Joseph is saying through the interpretation of these dreams that he's going to be over them, which I find very interesting. We already know from the opening verses that they're kind of on their ropes with Joseph in the first place, and you can only imagine if you don't like somebody and then they're telling you, hey, I'm going to be over you, it's going to kind of add fuel to that fire a little bit. Why do you think Joseph would share these dreams? Any thoughts on that? Ross? Yeah, gold star to Ross. That's basically what I have. So there's the negative side, just to recap, the negative side is, Joseph's gloating a little bit with his family. The positive side is maybe Joseph is just confused. I would even maybe add to that positive side a little bit. Maybe he acknowledges these dreams are coming from God. And we see from Joseph's actions, he's a very straight arrow, which is surprising coming from this family. But maybe he's trying to tell them these things to get them off his case a little bit. Which obviously does not work, but he still tried. But there's really two different reasons why Joseph could be sharing these. The other point I wanted to make here in these verses is something Jesus brings up in Mark 6:4. He brings up the expression, a prophet is without honor in his own country, or is not without honor except for in his own country. This idea that if you're not in your hometown, people regard you very highly, but the minute you go back home, they remember how you were, how you are, and they kind of disregard you a little bit. And as I think about Joseph here, he's sharing his dreams, the interpretation of these dreams with his family, right? But then he's going to go to Egypt, and he's going to be interpreting the dreams of a butler and a baker. He's going to be interpreting the dreams of Pharaoh, right? And they're going to regard him with great honor for that. But yet his own family here is like totally dismissive of him, which I think is very interesting. Any thoughts or comments on that? Yes. Yeah.
Imagine Joseph hearing, seeing this thing. Hey guys, I got this cool story.
Yeah.
It is not about the godly prophecy concepts associated
Yeah.
with this. You can't read into that, but I just kind of
Yeah.
defer more to the second side of it. Like, I just want to share this thing I saw.
Yeah.
It's a really cool dream.
And basically, I'm in the same camp because given the track record of Joseph we see in Scripture, I would think very positively of Joseph that he has good intentions. But yeah, I hadn't thought about if even Jacob's dream is like the first recorded dream that we have. So that's definitely something to consider. Anything else that anyone wants to talk about here? Once again, I'm scanning for hands. Yes.
Maybe this was shared so that God's plan could go like it was supposed to. I mean, there's a reason that his brothers, he was sold into slavery, and this certainly helped them want to get rid of him.
Yes. And that's exactly right. And we'll see in the verses we're about to read, they specifically say, look, here comes the dreamer, right? So they're making a direct connection between these dreams and what they're going to do to him, why they want to get rid of him. So that's a good point. Yes?
God's hand is in all of this.
Yeah.
And the story of Joseph and his brothers is a story of dramatic contrast. You don't find anything endearing in his brothers, even by the actions that we're going to get into later on in this chapter, and then the insert chapter later on about Judah. But there's nothing endearing about his brothers at this point. And I find it ironic or remarkable, probably the better word, that this chapter, and then you look in with the last chapter
Very good point. Kenny?
One of the things that you can kind of see in this is Joseph is Jesus. That Joseph is going to be a foreshadow of Jesus. And Joseph is one of the few characters that we don't know anything bad about. David was another person that we don't know much bad about. In a verse or two here, Jacob has had his name changed to Israel, yet we will persistently never call him Israel.
Yeah.
Except in verse 13, where Israel sends his favorite son to his sinful brothers. Boy, this just sounds like Jesus all over.
Yep.
And here's somebody who's having a real insight into your purpose is bigger than you. That you're going to do things that are more important than who you are. And that you're going to take on a larger role than you think you will. And so I think one of the things that I think God is basically trying to set Joseph up. And by the way, being picked by God, not an easy life. And that's going to be the other theme that's going to come through for Joseph. He is going to be rewarded after paying a very high price.
That's right. Joseph's life is not all sunshine and rainbows, for sure. All right, we're going to go ahead and move on to the next set of verses. That'll be 12 through 28. Beginning in verse 12, Now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, Are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them. And he said to him, Here I am. So he said to him, Go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word. So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. And a man found him wandering in the fields. And the man asked him, What are you seeking? I am seeking my brothers, he said. Tell me, please, where they are pasturing the flock. Not pestering, pasturing. And the man said, They have gone away, for I heard them say, Let us go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. They said to one another, Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams. But when Reuben heard it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, Let us not take his life. And Reuben said to them, Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore. And they took him, and they threw him into a pit. The pit was empty, and there was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat, and looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, where their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh, on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. And his brothers listened to him. Then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. They took Joseph to Egypt. So a couple things to unpack here. First, of course, Joseph is told to go check on his brothers. I'm assuming, he was more than willing to do his father's will here, but given their relationship or his relationship with the brothers, if it was me, I wouldn't necessarily be wanting to go check on my brothers, but Joseph willingly goes, right? And you can kind of make out on the map, hopefully it's easier to see, but Hebron Valley is down where he starts. He's traveling all the way to Shechem to check on his brothers. Now, Shechem is, of course, what we read about in Genesis 34, where Simeon and Levi wiped out the entire town. But he goes there, they're not there, he meets a guy, the guy tells him that his brothers are actually in Dothan with the sheep. So he goes on a little bit further. And then, of course, his brothers see him, and they're just so happy to see him. They're getting ready to throw him a welcome party. No, they are wanting to murder Joseph. And you might look at this and think, well, surely these brothers wouldn't kill anyone. Well, they have killed before. This is not necessarily out of their wheelhouse. So they're ready to kill him. And we see Reuben step up to the plate here and say, well, let's throw him into the pit. But then he doesn't communicate the latter part of what he's thinking. He doesn't say, well, let's throw him in the pit now, and once he's had a timeout, I'll get him out later. No, he lets them throw him in the pit and basically leaves what he's thinking out of the picture. Why do you think Reuben might have not said what he was thinking here? One of the thoughts I had on this is, in this case right now, brother-wise, it's 10 brothers versus one brother, right? If Reuben speaks up here and says what he's thinking and they don't like it, it's now turned to 9 brothers versus 2 brothers, right? Those are still really bad odds. So I wondered here if maybe Reuben didn't say anything, obviously to have God's will be done, but also just because he was afraid for his own safety. So we see Reuben, he leaves the picture for some reason. He steps away for a minute, and then we see these Ishmaelites come by, and we see Judah bring up this idea of, hey, why don't we profit from this a little bit? We won't get his blood on our hands. Why don't we sell Joseph into slavery? And this sounds good to them, so they end up doing this. And something I thought was interesting here is, how much silver did they get for selling Joseph into slavery? 20 pieces of silver. How many brothers were involved in this? More than likely 10, right? Because Benjamin's young, he's back at home. So if you divide that up and you assume all 10 brothers are involved, that's 2 pieces of silver per brother for selling their brother into slavery. So I thought that was an interesting thing to consider here as well. Any thoughts or questions on this before we move on? I'm scanning. Ross, I see your hand. Thank you.
Verse 28 confuses me a little bit, and it probably requires looking at the Hebrew, but then some Midianite traders, which Midianite is different than the Ishmaelites we heard about earlier, and in just a little bit, I don't know whether it's the same group and called differently. Anyway, then some Midianite traders passed by, so they, I'm not sure who the they is, pulled him up and lifted Joseph out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. Thus they brought Joseph into Egypt. Like, who is doing what?
Who actually bought Joseph? Like,
Are Midianites like just popping out of nowhere and they actually sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites? Are Midianites and Ishmaelites the same and the they is actually the brothers? I have never read it closely enough to see like who in the world is doing what.
yeah, I don't have a great answer for you on that one. Steve?
As you read the Old Testament, they're used interchangeably because historically they were members of a caravan that shared things in common. And from a genealogy standpoint, the Ishmaelites were the descendants of Hagar. The Midianites were descendants of Keturah by Abraham. So they were actually Ishmael and Midian were first cousins.
So kind of familial. I don't do well with that, the whole I'm my own grandpa stuff. I don't follow that.
In history, they hung out,
Gotcha.
traveled this route from Carolina.
So I don't know if we necessarily solved your question, Ross, but I don't have a great answer for it. I would take what Steve's got. I see hands. Yes.
The other thing to consider when we're talking about Reuben, again, and I could be wrong about this, I don't think there's redeeming quality in the brothers. You might think that on the surface with what Reuben's plan is,
Yeah.
him stepping away. I tend to think in the text, and again, it's unclear, but that he's trying to curry favor with his father. He's trying to set himself up
Yeah.
above the brothers. So there could be a little fear of what are the other brothers going to do if I'm on Joseph's side. I don't think he's on Joseph's side. I think he's on Reuben's side. And I think he concocted a separate plan in his head to curry favor with his father.
Yeah.
And again, I think that, to me, that makes more sense in the text as we see these stories with the brother.
Yeah.
Subject for consideration.
Yeah. Yes. Yep. And there was nothing for him in the pit, right? They didn't give him a meal before they kicked him in, it doesn't seem. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. It's a very good point. Anything else on this? All right, let's move on to the next set of verses. So verses 29 through 36, I'll read those really quickly. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes and returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone, and I, where shall I go?" Then they took Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in the blood. And they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father and said, "This we have found. Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not." And he identified it and said, "It is my son's robe. A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning." Thus his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. So we see here Reuben gets back. Reuben is distraught. And I think going back to Eric's point, it would make a lot of sense that Reuben's distraught by this because this was his inroad with his dad. He's already on the outs, right? He's already slept with one of his dad's wives. We see in Genesis 49 when Jacob's passing out blessings, Reuben's not getting a favorable one. So maybe this was Reuben's big plan to get favor. But Reuben's distraught by this. And ultimately they concoct this scheme in order to basically break the news to Jacob that Joseph is no more, right? So they end up going to Jacob, and obviously Jacob's distraught by the news, but I was really fascinated by how they present this information to Jacob himself. This is really a master class in deception. So they take the robe, right? They cut it up so it looks like a wild animal got this robe. They dip it in blood, and they take it to their father, and they're like, "Hey, is this his robe?" Like, you know, they're not providing details like, "Hey, we found this skeleton, we found this animal," nothing like that. They're simply just, "Is this his robe?" Because he could infer his own conclusions from what he saw before him. And then, of course, we see Jacob being distraught by what he sees, and Jacob coming to the conclusion himself that he's obviously been killed by a wild animal. So once again, we see deception all throughout the life of Jacob, and I really think we see it here again as well. But overall, what we see in Genesis 37 is even though Joseph's going through all these horrible things, God's using all of these for good. He's using it for the good of Joseph, and he's ultimately using it for the good of Joseph's family as well, even though they're doing these horrible things to him. Any thoughts or questions on Genesis 37 before we move on? Ross, yes.
One more real quick.
You're good.
A friend pointed this out to me, and I just thought it was really cool. So the next time that the brothers see Joseph, first it'll be 10 of the brothers because Benjamin stays behind. So 10 of the brothers see Joseph, and then after that, Benjamin has to come with. So 11 brothers see Joseph that second time, and they pointed out, like Kenny was talking about, like Jesus and Joseph parallels.
Mhm.
The first time that all the 12 disciples are gathered, it's actually not 12. Judas is dead and Thomas isn't there, so it's 10. And then the next time Thomas is there, so it's now 11. And it was just like, whoa.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
And then it's the same number of people who see him again that first and second time.
I'm going to let Ross teach in 2 weeks. Like, he's got this. Like, that's good stuff. All right, any other comments or questions? Kenny. Yeah. Well, there's a goat in Genesis 38 as well, so that's a great transition. Genesis 38. So, everybody knows Genesis 37, right? Not many people probably have read or considered or thought about Genesis 38. There's not a lot of sermons out there about it. I'm not trying to give Josh a sermon series idea. Genesis 38 is not the one I would pick. Brian Tellenhusing actually sent me a sermon back from 2020. I think Chris Emerson did. And I thought it was good. I'm going to try to bring in some of those points as we go through this. Because Genesis 38 is a little bit of a bleak, like, interlude, weird chapter as we're studying it. And I have a picture of a lion on here because as we know from Genesis 49, Judah is ultimately, it's said that he's a lion's cub, right? We know the Lion of Judah himself, Jesus, is coming from the line of Judah. But Judah's not perfect. Judah definitely is not perfect, and this chapter is going to probably cement that in stone for us. But it's a reminder that even though we ourselves might not be perfect, because we're not, God can still use us to accomplish his perfect plan. Let's read Genesis 38, 1 through 5. It happened at the time that Judah went down from his brothers and turned aside to a certain Adulamite, whose name was Hira. There Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite, whose name was Shua. He took her and went into her, and she conceived and bore a son, and he called his name She conceived again and bore a son, and she called his name Onan. Yet again she bore a son, and she called his name Shelah. Judah was in Chezib when she bore him. So we get this introduction to Judah and his friend Hira, who I've also been calling Hira, so just understand I might interchange those, I'm sorry. But Judah and Hira. I don't think Hira is necessarily the best influence, as we'll see a little bit later on in the chapter. You know, normally when you pick friends, you might want somebody that's going to challenge you on some poor decisions, and I don't see a lot of that coming from Hira. But while Judah is up hanging out with Hira, he sees a Canaanite woman that he likes, and he decides he wants to marry her. Now, automatically here, our biblical spider sense should be tingling a little bit because we've not seen anything good that comes from marrying a Canaanite woman up to this point. In fact, when we go back to what Abraham did for Isaac, his son, he made an effort to make sure that Isaac married someone from the family. When we go back to Isaac, Isaac made an effort to make sure that Jacob married someone from the family. And in fact, when Esau married people from the land, married Canaanites, that was frowned upon. So some red flags should be going up here that Judah marries a Canaanite. But Judah has 3 sons. He has he has Onan, and he has Shelah, who I'm calling the first Australian because of obvious Australian references there with Shelah. But he has 3 sons. So any thoughts or comments on the first verses to Genesis 38? Pretty innocuous so far. All right. So I'm going to recap for you Genesis 38, 6 through 11. So essentially what happens is Judah picks Tamar as a wife for So he kind of arranges this marriage, right? So marries Tamar, but is so bad that God just kills him. And ultimately that leaves Tamar without a husband, and that leaves Judah without a son, right? So Judah has this conversation with his son Onan and says, hey, we've got to continue the bloodline. We've got to make sure that we've got descendants. I need you to have kids with Tamar. And especially today, we look at this and we're like, wow, that's really weird. If you were to go over to Deuteronomy 25:5 and look there, in a few hundred years in the old law, it's actually spoken that and written for us that if you had a brother that died, it was the responsibility of another brother in the family to go in and actually have kids. And if not, they were supposed to be like slapped in the face with a sandal and some other stuff. So this would be commonplace for the time. But somewhere between this conversation with Judah and actually having kids with Tamar, Onan decides he doesn't want to do it. And because of that, Onan is struck dead. So now Judah's down 2 kids, Tamar's down 2 husbands, and Judah has this conversation with Tamar where he's like, hey, I've got 1 kid left, it's Shelah. He's young, I don't really want to lose him yet. So how about you go back to your father's house, and I'll tell you when Shelah's ready to be married, and then we'll kind of pick up from there. And Tamar agrees with this. So Tamar goes back to her father's house and waits for word to be sent that there's supposed to be another marriage. So any thoughts or questions on Genesis 38, 6 through 11? All right, thank you guys. Genesis 38, 12 through 23, I do want to read this. This to me is just bizarre. And I think by the time we finish reading it, you will agree. Beginning in verse 12, in the course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. When Judah was comforted, he went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers, he and his friend Hira the Adulamite. And when Tamar was told, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep, she took off her widow's garments and covered up with a veil, wrapping herself up, and sat at the entrance to Eniam, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah was grown up, and she had not been given to him in marriage. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. He turned to her at the roadside and said, come, let me come in to you. For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. She said, what will you give me that you may come into me? He answered, I will send you a young goat from the flock. And she said, if you will give me a pledge until you send it. He said, what pledge shall I give you? She replied, your signet and your cord, and your staff that is in your hand. So he gave them to her and went in to her, and she conceived by him. Then she arose and went away, and taking off her veil, she put on the garments of her widowhood. When Judah sent the young goat, When Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adulamite to take back the pledge from the woman's hand, he did not find her. And he asked the men of the place, "Where is the cult prostitute who was at Enem before at the roadside?" And they said, "No cult prostitute has been here." So he returned to Judah and said, "I have not found her." Also the men of the place said, "No cult prostitute has been here." And Judah replied, "Let her keep the things as her own, or we shall be laughed at. You see, I sent this young goat, and you did not find her." This is just all sorts of fun. So Judah's wife dies, right? Shua, the Canaanite that he married was the mother of his 3 sons, dies. So he goes to hang out with Hira again. And along the way, Tamar finds out that all this is happening. And Tamar's not stupid. She knows that Sheila's old enough to be married, and Sheila's not been given to her as a husband. So she develops this plan in order to solve this. So like all good plans, it starts out dressing and acting like a prostitute. And she decides that she's going to wait on this road, wait for Judah to pass by. And that's exactly what happens. Judah passes by. Judah engages with her, and they talk. They settle on terms and conditions, right? And I can't help but think, given the situation, obviously Tamar's watching Judah, right? She can see what Judah has on his person. He obviously doesn't have any goats, right? So she's like, "Well, give me a goat." And he's like, "Well, I don't have any goats with me right now. You can't put a goat in your pocket or anything." And he's like, "What can we agree on in the meantime," right? So what they end up settling on is a signet, a cord, and a staff. What would the importance of these 3 items be? What would these 3 items do? Yes, definitely that. It would also identify you as the person that you say you are, right? It would be the equivalent of like giving somebody our driver's license today, right? If you give somebody your driver's license and your picture's on it, you're obviously who you say you are. So I would almost say here, Tamar is very smart with how she goes about selecting the items and kind of the process of getting there. I'm not saying this plan is smart at all, but she basically gets to the point where she's like, "Hey, you don't have a goat? Give me these items." Those are the items that she needs at the end of the chapter to prove that Judah is the father. So ultimately, the deed is done, and Judah goes back and sends Hira out with this goat to try to find this person, and they can't find her. And he's talking to the people, and they're like, "Well, there's no cult prostitute here." So this raises all sorts of questions with me, but this is the one that I want to bring up, which is, keep in mind, Judah is a son of Jacob, who's a son of Isaac, who's a son of Abraham. They are in a covenant relationship with Yahweh. Like, undoubtedly, Judah himself bears the sign of this covenant, but yet we're still dealing with cult prostitutes at this time. It's a weird story. Any thoughts or questions up to this point? Josh?
See again that the idolatry has not been removed out of Jacob's family either.
Yeah.
The use of the term cult prostitute, clearly, okay, there's all kinds of things wrong with Judah's actions here, but part of his action is this is a sacred right that he's engaging in with this woman.
Yeah, that's right. Eric?
I find it interesting, too, his comment when this all plays out. He says, "She is more righteous than I." And I think that specific passage in this context really just, it just screams out.
Yeah.
And going back about all the brothers, right? And then we have the blessing of Scripture. When we flash forward to Matthew and the genealogy, there are 4 women that are listed in the genealogy. She's one of them.
That's right.
And again, it's God's plan and God working out that the Christ will come from this lineage and will be there to save all of mankind, not just the Jewish nation. But anyway, I just find it remarkable the statement he made. She is more righteous than I.
That's right. And given the situation, that just seems like a mind-boggling thing to even say. But Steve, maybe Kenny then? Yes.
You're gonna run out of time, but
That'll be fine.
not only is Perez in the genealogy of Joseph, which Joseph is actually not the father of Jesus, God is, but in Luke the 3rd chapter, Mary is also, or Perez is also in the lineage of Mary, so that Tamar's son is in the lineage of Christ. So God provided a son through Judah, through the genealogy of Abraham and Isaac, and killed the 3 of the Canaanite women
Kenny?
I think one of the dangers here is to say, well, if Lord goes into their life, at this point, they really the son of Israel. Aren't those Israelites idiots for basically obeying, keeping up with the idols? And we do exactly the same thing. We all have our idols. We all have things that we do not want to get rid of, that we hold on to a little bit too closely. I think idolatry, worshiping for them, was a way to ensure that their pastures were green, that their flocks were well. It was the wrong thing to do. By the way, what she does is the wrong thing as well. But isn't it interesting that he is so predictable that she knew that this is exactly what he would do?
Yep.
So I mean, this is a guy who had his idols, and we do too.
That's a good point. All right, we're going to go ahead and skip ahead. So I've got Maury on the slide. If you're familiar with the social stigma around that, he did a lot of paternity tests. That was kind of his thing. We get one of these to an extent in the remaining verses in the chapter. So to recap for the sake of time, ultimately 3 months pass from what we just read. Judah finds out Tamar is pregnant, and his first reaction is not, well, when is the gender reveal or anything like that. His first reaction is, we're going to go burn her, like we're going to go kill her. And ultimately, Tamar sends a messenger. She doesn't go have the conversation with Judah in person, but she sends a messenger to Judah. And I thought it was really interesting what she told the messenger to say, right? She doesn't come out and say, hey, messenger, say this is clearly Judah's stuff, like this is his, have him own it. No, she tells the messenger, and we will read these verses. Let me scan down really quick and see which ones these are. It's going to be verse 25. I'll begin reading. As she was being brought out, she sent word by her father-in-law, by the man to whom these belong, I am pregnant. And she said, please identify who these are, the signet and the cord and the staff. So I find it really interesting that she once again phrases it that way, and then Judah's the one that draws the conclusion, oh yeah, that's my stuff. And then he realizes that he is the father. We do hit on verse 26, which is the verse that Eric was alluding to, which is basically Judah says that Tamar is more righteous than him, which once again, given the situation, is just insane to think about. But we also see, as has been discussed, Perez, right? Perez pops up in both Matthew 1 at verse 3 and Luke 3 at verse 33, the genealogy of Christ. So God accomplishes his purposes. He brings about Christ through this incident, really. And ultimately, I do want to bring up the point that Judah is a different person later. What do I mean by that? Well, I'm not going to, give account for everything Judah does, but specifically when we see Judah come up in chapter 43, 44, 45, 46, like he is dealing with situations in a much different way. He is, even going back to 37 where he's selling his brother in slavery, when he's talking to Joseph and he doesn't know it's Joseph, and he's recounting the story, he's like, I'm not going to do this to my dad again, right? So Judah does approach things differently later, but that doesn't change the fact Genesis 38 is a wild chapter. Any thoughts or questions on this? All right, that's going to do it. So next week, I believe we're doing 39. Is it 39 and 40, Steve, or just 39? 39. We'll be doing Genesis 39 next week. Thank you.